I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there. I'm going to talk today about the Sewell report. I'll get into details of what that exactly is in a bit, but it's important to cover a few bases beforehand. This is an unfortunate necessity, which was really the case because people barely agree on the meaning of terms anymore, so it's kind of necessary to cover the language beforehand. A quick sort of TLDR, I guess, about the Sewell report. It was a commissioned report by our current government, which is Conservative, in response to the spread of Black Lives Matter protests over here to the UK and several historical and relatively recent high-profile cases in which racism is alleged to have been involved, and current events since the report have also helped to reframe the contents of the report. For example, a police officer in the Met, that's the Metropolitan Police, was outed as being a member of a far-right organisation, an organisation far enough right to be considered illegal and terroristic, which kind of casts a certain light on the whole thing. But as I said, first thing to do is to clarify some things. What is racism? Now, my definition as a sort of lay scholar, I suppose, and a writer, someone who is an expert, I guess, to be egotistical for a moment, in semantics, my definition of racism is that it is prejudice on the basis of race, just as sexism is prejudice on the basis of sex, and so on. This is not what a lot of grievance studies, I know that's an aggravating term, but it's a good catch-all. It's not what a lot of them mean by racism. They mean racism to them is prejudice plus power. So for them, prejudice doesn't matter unless you also have power behind it that you wield. So to them, a black person can't be racist because they are the oppressed person in this understanding of racism. So it doesn't matter how repugnant the leaders of the Nation of Islam are towards Jews, for example, they can't be racist because they are an oppressed minority. I think this is bunk. I think it leads to a lot of miscommunication and problems, but nonetheless, that's what they mean. You know, I would debunk that by saying if we look at the demographics of society in which racism is most prevalent, at least here in the UK, it tends to be amongst the lower working class and the underclass, people who have a great deal of financial insecurity, who have no real political or social power whatsoever. And it is that lack of power, that insecurity and the exploitation of it that gives rise to fairly intense racism in those communities. Furthermore, here in the UK, you will find that this demographic is often more racist towards Poles and Romanians than they are to second, third, fourth generation Afro-Caribbean people in the UK. So to me, that definition just falls on its face immediately, because from what I can see, for the most part, the largest cohort that is racist is the people with the least power. Indeed, that would also explain the appeal of things like the Black Hebrew Israelites and the Nation of Islam within those communities, because it provides a narrative of power and grievance to people who feel slighted and powerless. Anyway, the Sewell report largely concerns itself with institutional and systemic racism. Now, these terms are somewhat interchangeable, but again, people don't mean the same thing you or I would mean when they invoke institutional racism or systemic racism. You say that to me, or I use the term, and I would think that institutional racism would have to be racism that has been instituted, that it is part of an institution, that it is something like apartheid or anti-Palestinian sentiment in Israel and the different laws and so on that are in effect when it comes to Palestinians and Arab Israelis. To me, that's what institutional racism would be. And to me, systemic racism would mean that there was a sufficient critical mass of people within a system, an organization, like, say, the police force, who were racist, that the institution itself took on the character of that. So, to me, institutional racism would need to mean institutional racism, and systemic racism would be a slightly softer definition where the society as a whole was so prejudiced that it was a de facto institutional racism. Of course, in that second case, you wouldn't have to just be prejudiced within a system, you would also have to ignore the rules of that system. A racist who follows the rules about treating everyone the same is not really so much of a problem, if you follow me. What do they mean by institutional racism? To quote Wikipedia, for want of a better source, racism embedded as normal practice in society or in an organisation, discrimination in the criminal justice system, employment, housing, healthcare, political power and education. Systemic, again, kind of means the same thing, but it has a subtly different meaning. It can mean a racist effect, even without anyone's intention to be bigoted. This is where you get ideas like the whole implicit bias, that whole idea, even though it's been debunked and the implicit bias training has been shown to have little or no effect, and that racism awareness actually makes things worse in companies, never mind. That's the kind of thing they mean. For example, say you're a pharmaceutical company and you move to human trials and you're in a country that is majority white, say, like the UK, and you call for volunteers. Now, due to very, very broad demographic trends, just the sheer scale of the population and so on, the volunteers that you get for these medical trials are likely to be white, they're likely to be male, they're likely to be young. And at the cutting edge of medicine, this is one of the very few places that ethnicity actually matters at all. So you may find that a drug that is perfectly safe for young white men is not so good for elderly black women, even though you've done your human trials and so on. Now, they would attribute this to racism rather than just, perhaps, we might say, oversight or forces beyond the control of a company, a pharmaceutical company, or whatever the case might be. I'm just using that as a specific case. Nobody is setting out with the intention to be racist. Nobody wants to be racist. There's no explicit demand for young white men to be the ones who come forward, but that is what happens. It would be unethical to forcefully draft old black women to be part of the test. They do what they can, but you can only work with the volunteers that you have. But they would consider that to be an example of racism. Whereas, to me, I think you need the intention there as well. There are other instances where things are trickier. We have stereotypes, we have biases, we have prejudices as sort of cheat codes for our brains. If we have bad experiences, for example, when we're very young, then we're likely to be overly concerned about those things when we grow up. If you have a bad experience as a toddler of falling into a river and nearly drowning, there's reasonably good odds that your brain will be conditioned to be afraid of water later on in life, or to be disproportionately afraid of water. Similarly, if you're a policeman on the front lines, day in, day out, and you are assigned to a beat that happens to be a high percentage of racial minorities, immigrants, those people in this area tend to be poor, you're likely to run into a disproportionate amount of crime and to develop a perfectly understandable bias. But most people work to overcome that using their conscious mind, which is why implicit bias is really a pseudoscience. So what do I mean? I mean prejudice on the basis of race. And that is the context in which I'm going to talk about it here. And if I talk about institutional racism, to me that would require the institution to be explicitly racist. And for something to be systemic, a considerable majority, say 2/3 of the population, would have to both disregard the rules and be deeply prejudiced and biased. Now, I don't think either of those are true in modern, weird nations. You can feel free to disagree, but I hope to kind of give my case. God, this is such a huge preamble, but you kind of have to do that in these cases. Now, there are two things that make up grey areas, edge cases, when it comes to systemic and institutional racism, I think. I'm going to use one example from the United States and one example from over here in the UK to illustrate these grey areas, because I don't really think anything is completely black and white. The big debate in the US at the moment is about voter suppression. The Republican Party wants to bring in laws that make it harder to vote, that require voter ID. There is no actual problem with people voting who shouldn't, or voting in the names of other people and so on. It happens, but it happens at such a fantastically minute level that it makes no difference in all practicality. But the Republican Party in the US has whipped all this up, and if you don't really think too hard about it, it makes sense. You don't want people voting who aren't entitled to vote, you don't want people voting for other people, you don't want voter fraud to take place, even if it is vanishingly rare. So demanding that everybody have voter ID doesn't seem like it's something that could be racist. And I would say that it isn't, though the intention of Republican lawmakers is to suppress the vote of ethnic minorities who are more likely to vote Democrat. It also suppresses the vote of poor, working class and underclass whites who are actually more likely to vote Republican. But I think they just figure they can get away with that because there are more white people being the majority. There are more Republican voters in those demographics for whatever reason. So they're willing to disenfranchise poor whites in order to disenfranchise poor black and brown people. Is it racist, though? Well, the intention is, the law isn't, but it is going to have a massively disproportionate effect on black and brown people in the United States, and therefore Democrats, thereby, in a world of rapidly shifting demography, allowing them to survive and keep the Democrats out more, alongside gerrymandering and other issues. I'm not saying either party is exactly a bed of roses, but in this case it's the Republicans. So you can't actually point to anything in the law to say that it's racist, but it has a disproportionate impact. Some of these provisions say that you can get a free voter ID, but as it turns out, the paperwork and the other forms of ID that you need to get your voter ID can end up costing a lot of money. Now, there's an opportunity here, I would say, from my class wealth oriented perspective, to build solidarity because it's not just black and brown people that are going to be excluded by this demand for ID, but also poor white people. So there's a better, stronger fight, one that crosses ethnic lines, if you say this is going to disenfranchise poor people, rather than if you say this is going to disenfranchise black and brown people. I mean, they're included in poor people, relatively speaking, disproportionate poverty. But one of these creates a broad base of support and is an argument of principle, so your universal access to voting. The other one buys into the racial narrative and divides people even more. And here's another grey case over here in the UK. As part of these new legal proposals that the government's putting forward, there are crackdowns on trespassing, which seems harmless, right? After all, you don't want people coming onto your property, staying there, squatting, whatever else the case might be. So just from the letter of the law, it doesn't appear to be discriminatory. It doesn't single anyone out. But it will disproportionately affect gypsies and New Age travellers. Sorry, Roma. Whenever I've met a gypsy, they've always called themselves gypsies, excuse me. So when you look at the effect of the law, it disproportionately affects these travelling communities, right? But there's nothing explicitly in the law that targets them. And this affects everybody, not just them. So the effect might be racialised, though, depending on your point of view, the Roma and the New Age travellers are pretty mixed, really. So, yeah, it's hard to point at an ethnicity issue here. This is a way of life issue. So these are grey areas where the law itself is not racist. The impact could be considered to be biased or prejudiced, but it's a hard argument to make. So all I'm saying is there are also, difficult edge cases. So why am I talking about racism now? Why have I spent 15 minutes on preamble? Because this is a difficult issue and it's important to clarify and to show people what I'm talking about and why before I actually delve into it, in order to forestall a lot of hostility. So, just recently we had the Sewell report. This was a report into ethnic racial issues in the UK. Its full name is the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. The report. So this was done in response to BLM and all this other racialized issues that have been going on. A lot of minorities were involved in it, but it did still come out of a conservative government. And if we look at people like Priti Patel, for example, I think she disproves that diversity on surface characteristics is really very meaningful, because she's the epitome of a horrible Tory bigot, despite being of South Asian ancestry. But the Sewell report looked into claims about racism in the UK, examined society in the UK and the interplay of race, whether there was bias or prejudice at the institutional level, at the systemic level, and so on, and then made recommendations and so forth. Now, when this came out, it said that basically there is almost no institutional or systemic racism left in the UK, but that there is still interpersonal racism. As you can imagine, this went over about as well as an osmium zeppelin. Yeah, it just didn't fly with a lot of people within the activist community. Reading it for myself, I think they engaged in a lot of bad practice. I think it's tone deaf. I think there's aspects of it that made me gasp, such as them trying to reframe the Afro-Caribbean slavery experience as a triumph of the Afro-Caribbean community here in the UK. It's something they overcame. I think that's in keeping with a lot of the British character. We talk about our endurance during the Blitz and so on, but still, that was pretty tone deaf and terrible. I think. But its main fault was that it was not saying what people wanted to hear. Part of this was because it wasn't using the new grievance studies newspeak so much. It was more accessible. You can read it yourself. It's getting on for 300 pages, but I've read through it and it's interesting. So there were a lot of bad practices. Tone deaf. It reframed the Afro-Caribbean experience in a way that was bound to enrage people and was obvious if you read it. But its main sin with it was that it was not saying what people wanted to hear. People want to hear that Britain is still a deeply racist and horrible society, rather than understanding that a relative tiny minority of people can make life horrible for a much larger amount of other people. And it doesn't use the newspeak from grievance studies and woke scoldery. So that it's not a perfect report by any means. I trust anything out of the Tory party about as far as I can comfortably spit a rat. But even so, there's some good meat on these bones. And equally, the response to this report was bad. People talking about their lived experience. Anecdote is not data. The plural of anecdote is not data. The paper draws on resources which you can look at and you can find issues with, I'm sure, but it's reasonably academic with good references that you can go and you can check in on these things. And I'm sorry, but just because you had a bad experience doesn't mean that everybody has had a bad experience. Just because someone shouted the N-word at you on the Clapham omnibus does not mean that society as a whole is racist. And if people didn't intervene to defend you, it's just not a very British thing to get involved in fights and arguments unless you feel that you have to. It doesn't mean that anyone approves. They're probably giving the racist a very hard Paddington stare. But that's about as far as it goes in this country. People don't want to get hurt. People get paralysed with shock until someone does act. So you have to will yourself to act. But the point is that your subjective personal experience says fuck all about society as a whole. Absolutely nothing about it. And yet people want to prioritise and centre their lived experience of the one person or a couple of people, or people carefully selected to all have the same viewpoint and experience. It's just not valid. On a personal level, I care that something bad might have happened to you, but if we try to make claims about society as a whole, I'm going to need more than your say-so. Personal anecdote has no place in science, even sociology and grievance studies. Statistics matter. Good statistics, good studies. And the trouble is we're caught between activist studies and things like this from the government which seek to just dismiss those activist studies. Nobody seems to be approaching any of these issues from a neutral scientific perspective. So there's been a lot of backlash. For me, the statistics matter, the science matters. Is that cold and callous and uncaring? Perhaps. But I think you have to proceed from a position of knowledge if you hope to change anything for the better, or to recognise where the causes of problems really lie. And to me, from my own personal investigations into these issues, it has very much been the case that what people think of as racial or ethnicity issues are really class and wealth issues. Now, I may be biased, this may be my left-wing perspective, but when you control just for wealth, just for class, between poor blacks and poor whites, or the black and white community as a whole, you find that these disparities that people talk about virtually disappear. For example, in the United States, black people are about twice as likely to be arrested, but they're also about twice as likely to be poor, and we know there is a very strong correlation and probably causation between poverty and crime. So you would expect an impoverished community, relatively speaking, to have more crime. And so if an ethnicity is more likely to be poor, you would expect it to proportionally be more likely to involve itself in crime. And this is exactly what we see. And that's how you go about solving the problem, to my point of view. What has been massively overlooked in this fight between dismissive conservatives and catastrophizing activists is that this is a report from a conservative government, one of the most archly conservative governments we've had since Thatcher, I would say, more to the right than Thatcher, I would say. But in this report, they admit that class, wealth, and geography explain disparity, explain the huge gulf between rich and poor in this country, the unfairness, the unequal access to the fruits of our cooperative society. This is huge, and yet it's not being talked about. The Conservative Party, in this commission that they set up, has admitted class wealth disparity and geography. So they're essentially admitting that they have underinvested in the North, that the North has been neglected, that poor people are not being protected and looked after and given opportunities to advance in our society. They admit what is at the core of the Labour movement in a Conservative Party report. That's enormous. They're admitting that they have failed in all of these ways that the left-wing parties, such as Labour, have been trying to address for the entire period of their existence. That should be the story here. It's huge. So the response to complain that it is ignoring race and ethnicity, the attempts to discredit the report and so on, are counterproductive. Because if it is wealth and class disparity that is the root cause of these issues, and geographical as well, then dealing with these issues will also help the ethnic communities. If a certain amount of the disparities between these groups that you will admit is down to wealth and class and geography, even if you still think there's racism as part of it, that ethnic minority's status and success rate and so on is going to be elevated if we deal with the class and wealth issues for everybody anyway, and then you'll have a clearer picture of how much is actually down to bias, prejudice, racism. And in the meantime, you will have helped people. And you will have helped people across these ethnic divides, which helps to diffuse and disarm racial animus between the poor white community and the poor black and brown communities. So doesn't that make sense tactically, pragmatically? From a marketing standpoint, and I would say from a reality standpoint, if you look at the statistics? Because if you help everyone who is poor, if you increase social mobility, if you invest in education and so forth, you help everyone, and there is no wedge, there is no racial wedge you can drive between people. And you end up with a clearer picture of how much racism remains. Isn't that a good thing, a productive thing, a helpful thing to lift everyone up, reduce divisions, and to clarify how much prejudice genuinely remains? You would think so, but apparently not. So this report is by no means perfect, and it comes from a biased source, and it is being used to dismiss claims of racism and prejudice and so on. But it's not toothless, and it doesn't do this without grounds. The statistics bear this out. So the real question, once you deal with all that, once you absorb it and understand it, is why are the black and minority ethnic communities poorer as a whole? Why do they settle in areas outside the southeast of the UK, outside of London, outside of the home counties, for the most part, London being an exception? Social mobility is terrible in this country, but that applies to anybody and everybody who's poor, not just as immigrants, who are obviously starting lower on the rung, or people who have suffered from historical racism, even if there's no current racism. So you don't deal with these issues by furthering this racial wedge. You deal with it by dealing with the material circumstances, the class and wealth issue, social investment in the regions in the north and the urban areas up there. But if you concentrate your aid and your assistance on the basis of race, you just end up playing into the hands of the far right. It just beggars belief to me that a conservative party, a far-right conservative party, at the very edges of the Overton window here in the UK, that they can admit the driving force behind the Labour movement as being the most important thing. And nobody picks up on that. Not even the Labour Party. Zang. A problem for every games master has always been coming up with adventure ideas. For years now, Postmortem Studios has been helping out with the 100 Adventure Seeds line. These provide adventure ideas for all genres, and you can get them at RPG Now or lulu.com.
Word to your mom, came to drop off. Got more rhyme than the Bible got song. Just like the prodigal son not returned. Anyone stepping to me, they get worse. 'Cause I got lyrics, but you ain't got none. Come to battle, bring a shotgun.